A lot of folks tend to think that negative emotions are just all bad and we need to stay away from them, get rid of them. I think, but I think our negative emotions have gotten a bad rap. We think of them as negative because they are associated with negative things in life, and they're unpleasant, and that's why they have the label negative emotion. But they're an important part of growing up in a fallen world. They all have a meaning that corresponds to something in our fallen life and world. So anger, for example, corresponds to injustice in the way that God designed it. Anxiety and fear are appropriate emotions in the face of danger or harm that could happen to us, either physical harm or psychological harm. Sadness is an appropriate response to loss. And in a fallen world, all of these things can happen. So we ought not to view negative emotions as all bad, but rather what we want to do is see them as signs of a fallen world that need to be redeemed, that need to be brought into the new creation and healed. So part of what Christian counseling ought to do, I think, is to help people to recognize that their negative emotions, in a deep sense, share in the Christian's union with Christ's death. Christ died because of our fallenness, and he identified himself with our sin. He on the cross, he identified himself with our suffering on the cross when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He identified himself with our weakness by becoming a baby and growing up and then eventually being crucified. And in all those ways, he was identifying himself with human fallenness that corresponds to our experiences of fallenness in a world where we can grow up being neglected or hurt, abused, and Christian counselors deal with people who have had these kinds of problems. So what we want to help Christians to be able to do is when they experience negative emotions, to take them to the cross, to recognize that Christ is with me in my sorrow, that Christ is with me, and therefore he can undermine my fear, that Christ is on my side, and so he can be my defender when I'm being treated unjustly. And Christ can transform, then therefore, my negative emotion experience into a new creation resurrection experience, because I'm also united to Christ in my resurrection. In resurrection. And what he wants to do then is transform my negative emotion experience into a sense of his victory, his happiness, his joy, his healing of my fallenness. I also have to add that shame and guilt are important negative emotions because they are signifiers of my personal sin, or the fact that I am born in sin. And so the cross is especially important to resolve guilt and shame that everybody struggles with to some extent. And so I also want to take my guilt and shame to the cross and ask God to forgive me and cleanse me through Christ. And that also resolves my negative emotions. And then as I receive Christ's forgiveness and remember who I am in Christ, perfectly righteous and holy in Christ, I'm also brought into the new creation, and my emotions get resolved in that way as well. So these are ways in which Christ, I think, transforms our negative emotions into the positive emotions of the new creation.